going to pick up in this session in Mark the 11th chapter. We'll read verses 15 through 19. We will have just a brief discussion once again of what the verses have to speak to us today, and then we will close out. Let's begin reading at verse 15 of Mark the 11th chapter. So they came to Jerusalem, and then Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of thieves." And the scribes and the chief priests heard it, and they sought how they might destroy him. For they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teaching. And when the evening had come, he went out of the city. And so we are going to go back and just take a brief look at what many have termed the idea of the cleansing of the temple. In verse 15, basically the first thing that we find out is that this temple of the court had been turned into a business center. And we understand that this was never God's intent. His temple was meant to be a place of prayer and worship. And so instead of this being a place of prayer and worship, it had become more of a place of business and commerce. Now, for most people, the things that were taking place at the temple seemed to be necessary, and they were fine. Certainly they were convenient, and so most people had no problem at all with with the system and the way things worked. Basically, there were things that were being done, and you don't have to go into great detail as you're studying with someone, but during certain feast times, there were things that must be purchased and things that must be brought, and so the money changers were changing or exchanging money for some of the fees that would need to be paid. They were potentially selling animals for sacrifices that needed to take place. And so basically those that had begun the work had seen this just as an opportunity to make money based on a need that they felt had been created. And as far as the people were concerned, they thought it was convenient for them to be able to go ahead and to purchase and or do exchanges in that particular spot because it was in an area where they needed to be anyway. Without going into, again, great detail, you might discuss the fact that the exchange rate was basically being done at a usurious level. In other words, they were charging far more than what it would cost if they were to purchase some of these items at a different location. They were ramping up the prices in order to make a greater profit at the expense of those who were there looking for the convenience. The other thing that we can take note of in verse 15 are some of the key words that are used. You know, oftentimes Jesus is talked about as a man who is very meek and very gentle in spirit, and that is very true. One of the definitions, however, of meekness is power under control. And we can see here some of the power that Jesus has, or we can see some of the strength that Jesus has. He was not necessarily a weak man. The idea of casting out is to force out with violence. It takes strength. To overthrow the tables, to turn over the tables with the money and the various items that might have been on those. And it talks about that he would not suffer or allow for people to do this type of work and change his Father's house and the design for his Father's house. So basically he sees a situation and he takes control and he removes those who are violating the sanctity of the temple. In verse 16, we see the term, he would not allow anyone to carry out wares, or to carry wares through the temple. And what had been taking place is people were using the temple courtyard as a basically shortcut to travel back and forth between other things. And so they were just using this as this area as a way to save time and as a way to do those types of physical things that maybe they feel that they needed to do throughout their various ventures. This particular activity of just going through the temple showed a complete lack, or going through the courtyard would show a complete lack of reverence for the temple and what God had created it for, and also a complete lack of reverence for God as well. We understand the temple was meant to be holy, and it was supposed to be used solely for the purposes of worshiping and glorifying God. We also understand, if you were to look into the various levels of the temple, and again, this is something that if you want to go into, you can. It's not something that you have to go through with someone when you're just reading the text for purposes of gaining from the text. But if you wanted to go into a little bit more detail, one of the points that you could make is that the outer courtyard was as far as many of the non-Jewish people could go. So it was the only place that they had to come and to worship and to pray to God. And in the midst of trying to be spiritual and to think about God, there would be the chaos of having basically a business being run around them. All the commerce and the activity and the things that would be a distraction for those who wanted to focus on God. In verse 17, he taught them, saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of thieves." And so once again, as we have made mention of, and you can make mention when you're studying, once again, Jesus never misses an opportunity to teach. And so he takes the time to teach those that are there as well, and he does so by quoting from the Old Testament when it talks about, my house should be called a house of prayer for all nations. And so again, this would be extremely important to those who were non-Jewish, this idea of a house for all nations. And so the temple court, again, was their only place for worship. But it's important to recognize here and to point out that Jesus always takes advantage of the opportunities that exist to teach others, and he teaches from the use of God's Word. And so we can emphasize the importance when we're studying with someone of making sure that we are teaching from God's own Word. When it talks about the idea of a den of thieves, in the research that I did, really it could refer to a couple of different things. It could refer to a cave where robbers would hide themselves from those who were searching for them. So basically using the temple of God as a place of sanctuary for their evil activities. Or it could refer to a place where robbers hide and they're waiting for their victims to pass by. Again, in this idea of people waiting for those to pass through whom they could extort by selling things at such a high marked up price. So really this concept of den of thieves can be looked at in a couple of different ways. Based on what I have studied, it would appear that both of those would be legitimate descriptions for that idea. And then lastly, we close out with verses 18 and 19. And we see that the scribes and the chief priests, when they hear Jesus teaching, they choose to seek out how they might destroy him. And they do this because they fear him, because all the people were astonished at his teaching. These chief priests and scribes are the religious leaders. And so they are the ones that are supposed to be doing the teaching, and so they don't want someone coming along and speaking something different and speaking with such an authority that people would potentially follow after them instead of course, themselves. They feared Jesus because of his teachings, and it's because of, as was said, how the people respond to that. You see, the people were astonished and saw a stark contrast between what Jesus taught and the teaching of the chief priests and the scribes. And so here is this counter teaching, and the people are responding to that. And so it's putting the potential chief priests and scribes into a position where they may be losing their followers. So we're seeing here basically that Jesus has come in. He has cleaned up the temple courts. He has come in to help set things in order. And we see here where we have mentioned now of the chief priests and the scribes figuring out how they might destroy him. And we understand that they want to destroy him because of their fear of him. And so when evening comes after this day has taken place, he once again leaves the city. And so we will close out this particular study with that verse, and we will come back and we will see what happens upon the next morning. Once again, I encourage you to go back and to study what has been presented. Go back and look at these verses and take the time to find out for yourself, or to study for yourself and see what things come out and appear important to you and are things that you could use to teach others and yourself as well. Once again, thank you for your time.